Hi everyone, Omid from CodeLab here, and welcome back to the first video in our series on JavaScript. This video will be covering a basic introduction to JavaScript, what the language is about, some of its core concepts, and how to just do some basic stuff in it. So before we begin, a little bit about JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that's become very popular in the last 20 or so years, primarily because of how useful it is for both front and back end web development. It's also a interpreted language. It's not compiled. So that means that when you run your code in JavaScript, you have to be a little bit more careful. It's not like C++ or Java where a lot of stuff will be caught by the compiler. You can actually write some pretty shady and bad code and still get by the compiler and have a lot of things not go well at runtime. So that means that A, you need to be a little bit more careful when writing your code, and B, a little bit more thorough when testing your code, because you could have accidentally snuck some bad stuff by that you were still able to get through the interpretation phase of getting your code ready. Now, some other kind of ground stuff for JavaScript. It is also a language that runs very, very fast on the web because it's sort of been optimized over the years, but there's also a lot of stuff in it because it is a legacy language that needs backwards compatibility with old stuff from like 20, 30 years ago when it was being used in the very early days of web development. So when you're looking up documentation or looking for other JavaScript resources out there on the web, I would highly advise that you look for stuff that is a little bit more modern in its dating, just because stuff from even like 10 years ago is probably using old JavaScript standards and it's not as great code as what you can write today, because the language has really been sped up, modernized, and just kind of optimized over these last few years. Now, before we start coding, you will need to actually download something to be able to even run or install a JavaScript file. And to get that, you're going to want to go to nodejs.org. So nodejs.org, just go to their downloads page right here and then download their Windows installer or their Mac OS installer, whatever it is that you might need, and just get that done. Pause the video, come back once you got that fixed. And then now, once that's done, we're going to hop over to VS Code right here, and we're going to start coding a little bit of some basic JavaScript. So again, because JavaScript is an interpreted language and because of how it's sort of built, it's a little bit more similar to Python if you have experience with that. If more of your experience lies with C++ or Java, some of this stuff might seem a little bit unusual to you, but not to worries, we'll hop right into it. So let's first talk about just some of the basics like variable declaration. Like I need to make a variable in JavaScript. How do I actually do that? So there's actually 3 different ways to do it. One of them, very bad, and we'll start with that one. We're going to say var bad is equal to 3. Now there's a lot of stuff going on here. Don't worry too much about it, but just know that we declared this variable using this var keyword right here. And that's a bad thing to do. That's because when you use the var keyword, your variable is function scoped. But if we use the let keyword here and say let good is equal to 4, the let keyword is block scoped, which is much better. It means that we're only giving access to our information or our variable where we need it. We're not giving access to a much more broader scope. So that's why whenever you want to create a non-constant variable in JavaScript, use the let keyword, not the var keyword. Now obviously this bad thing right here is the variable name, and you're assigning it to a value of 3, the number. You might be wondering, where's the data type? How did he just do is equal to 3? Why isn't the compiler yelling at him right now? That's because in JavaScript, you actually don't type your variables. JavaScript will handle all of that stuff for you as long as you just do the assignment. It will handle underneath the hood everything that it needs to for you. So you can also assign text. So like I could say let good2 is equal to some text, and as long as I put it inside of double quotes, it will recognize that it's a string and it will process it as such. Very simple. Do not need to do any of that typing stuff. Now, one more thing that I would like to talk about is how to create objects in JavaScript. So this is a bit different. So in JavaScript, an object is simply just a literal collection of fields stored underneath one variable. Now, the structure that we use to sort of format this that you're going to see in a sec is very similar to something called JSON. You might have heard of this before. It's a very popular way of transmitting and storing and representing data in objects. There are some very slight differences underneath the hood, but essentially a JavaScript object is much like a JSON object. So you declare it just like a regular variable. So I can declare it using let, and I can say let my object equals these little brackets like this. And then the way that I can do it is that I use key value pairs inside of my object. So let's say that I want this object to represent some person and like some information about them. What I can do is in strings like this, I can just say first name is equal to Omid, and then I can say ID is equal to 3. So 2 things to note right here. The first is that in these key value things on the left, my key or my property, whatever it is that you do want to call it, that has to be wrapped as a string. So my key, my property is a string, okay? And then on the right is my value, and this can be any data type. It can be a string, a number, or you can actually nest these objects within themselves. So I could, if I wanted to, I'm not going to show it, but I could make ID equal to another object and go multiple levels down deep. Now, I did sort of skip ahead here. The third type of variable declaration that I did not show was for constant variables. So if you do have the need or desire to create a constant variable, you just use the const keyword and then you won't be able to change it again. Same concept with other constant variables from other languages. So like const myvar is equal to 3. Now I can no longer change it again, and now you'll actually notice that the variable shows up highlighted in a slightly different color. Now, last thing that I want to denote is that you'll actually notice that I'm not getting an error anywhere saying that I should put a semicolon on line 7, because on all of these other lines I put semicolons, but here I didn't. And that's because in JavaScript, semicolons actually aren't required. They're optional. However, we at Colab highly encourage that you always put semicolons just for cleanliness and consistency throughout your whole code. Okay. Now, one more thing also is that we need to actually have a way to sort of like spit this thing out and run this, because we do want to actually test that we can run this. And that's why you installed Node, because you need some way to run this file. Now, when we run it, nothing's going to actually happen or print out unless we print something to the console. So like C++, familiar with, you might be doing something like cout. In Python, it's been a long time since I've used Python. I think it's print. In JavaScript, you're going to be using something that is called console.log, and then these parentheses, and then these semicolon. And everything inside of this log function call is what you're passing in as a parameter for it to print. So I can just pass in a string like this and just say some object, and it will just literally print the word some object. But what if I want to print a variable? I can do colon, I can end my quotes, I can do a comma, and then I can actually print out this my object variable. So now that's my object variable, and now it's printed out. Alternatively, you can also embed that within the string. There's multiple ways to print out variables. This is just one. You do not have to do it this way. That's just one way that I wanted to show. So if we save that file, and now we go down to our command line and we change directory into our current working directory. So I'm currently working inside of my JavaScript part 1 folder. That's where I have this file saved. I can actually just type out the word node and then new app.js, and you'll see that it runs and prints out this exact thing right here. So very simple, very straightforward, just node filename.js, and it will run it and print out for you. Again, you do have to be in your current working directory. Now, one other thing that I did forget to mention that I do want to note is that this code will be available on GitHub, just as with every single other project that we are working on. This specific one is inside of the JavaScript folder, and this specific video can be found inside of the part 1 folder, part 2 for the next video, so on and so forth. Hopefully you guys are able to pick up some of the basics of JavaScript in this video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Thank you.